Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 28 June 2024. To the best of my knowledge, it is the 84th birthday of David Carr, who was born on this date in Parkersburg, West Virginia in 1940, and who, again, to the best of my knowledge, is still alive, making him an exception among most of the figures I have covered in these episodes. In 1974, Carr published Phenomenology and the Problem of History, a study of Husserl's transcendental philosophy. And then more than 40 years later, he returned to philosophy of history with Historical Experience, Essays on the Phenomenology of History, published in 2021. Of course, he wrote many other books in the intervening years and many papers on philosophy of history, but these two books offer a detailed presentation of his philosophy of history spanning half century, and I will focus on them, not least because I have copies of them. In my episode on Ludwig Landgrebe, I said that once a contemporary philosopher of history gets past their ritual renunciation of Hegel, which usually also takes other speculative philosophers of history, such as Vico, Spengler, and Toynbee in his train, the next step is crucial, since it's then we learn the alternative path that they're going to take. I mentioned Landgrebe in this connection because Landgrebe's next step after distancing himself from Hegel was to pursue a phenomenological philosophy of history. Like Ludwig Landgrebe, David Carr is a phenomenologist. So here is a brief sketch of how Carr understands phenomenological philosophy of history. Quote, rather than asking, what is history, or how do we know history, a phenomenology of history inquires into history as a phenomenon and into the experience of the historical. How does history present itself to us? How does it enter our lives? And what are the forms of experience in which it does so? Unquote. While both Landgrebe and Carr formulate phenomenological philosophies of history, their approaches are not identical, since they emphasize different aspects of the phenomenological program, even while there remains an underlying an underlying unity in virtue of which we can call them both phenomenologists. Landgrebe was, for example, much more influenced by Heidegger, while Carr stayed closer to Husserl. Also, Landgrebe places greater emphasis upon freedom from presuppositions, whereas Carr places greater emphasis on the phenomenological reductions. So what are the phenomenological reductions? This is a question that even those who have devoted their entire careers to studying phenomenology do not agree upon. There is disagreement among phenomenologists about how many reductions there are, what the significance is of each reduction, and how each relates to the other. Of the reductions, Richard Schmidt wrote, quote, phenomenology, according to Husserl, can begin only after the transcendental phenomenological reduction has been performed by the beginning phenomenologist. Descriptions not preceded by this reduction are not phenomenological. Anyone who wants to understand the claims made by Husserl for his transcendental phenomenology must, and even more, anyone who wants to employ the phenomenological method must first understand and practice the transcendental phenomenological reduction. But such understanding is difficult to achieve. Husserl's own descriptions are quite perplexing, and the commentators differ widely in their interpretations of these descriptions. And here is another account from Itzhak Miller's Husserl Perception and Temporal Awareness. Quote, the phenomenological reduction is described by Husserl in part as a methodological procedure, the carrying out of which is a necessary condition for gaining phenomenological knowledge or for doing phenomenology. As there is disagreement among phenomenologists about the nature and role of the noema in Husserl's theory, so there is not unrelated disagreement among them about the nature and significance of the phenomenological reduction. And then he adds this footnote. In fact, Husserl delineates not one, but a number of phenomenological reductions. It is clear, however, that one of them is the basic reduction in terms of which the other phenomenological reductions are defined, unquote. Immediately after writing this, Miller tells us why Aaron Gavitch was wrong about his exposition of the reduction. So we see immediately the differences among phenomenologists as to what exactly this crucial step means. So who you read about phenomenology is going to shape your impression about what exactly is going on. And someone could easily write a book or indeed a series of books about expositions and interpretations of the phenomenological reductions, and I'm not going to do that. So here's my version, admittedly too brief to be accurate, but only intended to give a rough and ready sense of what's going on. Ordinary experience begins in what Husserl calls the natural attitude. The natural attitude involves naive beliefs about the ordinary world and all the things that populate the ordinary world. For example, we believe that the world exists. We believe that the objects that populate the world exist, and we believe a number of things about them. To do phenomenology, it is necessary to suspend the natural attitude. This suspension is also called bracketing, since the idea is to put our ordinary beliefs in brackets and then set them to one side so we can pay attention to what manifests itself to consciousness without any preconceptions. So we see then there is an integral and intimate relationship between the reductions and freedom from presuppositions, which I mentioned was an emphasis of Ludwig Landgren. There are, of course, historical antecedents to the phenomenological reduction, especially in Pyrrhonism, which was the most radically skeptical movement in ancient philosophy. In fact, Husserl used the ancient Greek term from Pyrrhonism, epoche, to describe part of the phenomenological reduction. And I should say that this term is pronounced in any number of different ways. It could be epoche, 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 etc., since in transliterating from the Greek into Latin script, the final E is sometimes rendered with a macron, a flat bar over the E, and sometimes with the accent aigu, which is a rising bar over the E, and sometimes with both. So you could say that the confusion over pronunciation is justified given the many transliterations. So these kinds of little details can be confusing if you haven't previously encountered them. I wanted to mention it here, though it's not relevant to the ideas with which we are concerned. In any case, there are a sequence of steps involved in the phenomenological reduction that are intended to make us aware of what we are actually experiencing and not what we think we are experiencing because of our preconceptions. To add to the complexity and confusion, and the reason I am discussing the phenomenological reductions, is that Carr posited an historical reduction in his earlier books, modeled after the phenomenological reduction, but distinct from it, even more systematic and universal than the phenomenological reductions. Quote, just as the phenomenological epoche is explicitly practiced in the form of a method called phenomenological reduction, so the philosophical epoche must be systematized and universalized to become a philosophical reduction, or what might better be called a historical reduction, unquote. And here's a little more from later in the book, a longer quote. Quote, Husserl is heir to an intellectual tradition, and it is his intellect that is shaped by his historical situation. He inherits certain ways of thinking about the world, and these keep him from attending to and simply seeing the world as it really is. The objectivist tradition, according to this view, never was a way of seeing the world. It was only a conceptual framework for interpreting the world that is seen for purposes of scientific inquiry. The historical reduction, by making us aware of the interpretive and conceptual character of objectivism, has the same function the phenomenological reduction was always meant to have. It returns us to a position of pure seeing. The emphasis on seeing in phenomenology was never as simple as some critics have made out. It never amounted to the claim that we only need to look in order to see. The rigors and dangers of the phenomenological reduction, as described with great emphasis by Husserl, attest to this. It takes great effort to get ourselves into the position where we can see it all. Now, the historical reduction, as we have seen, adds to that effort. In order to arrive at this position, it is not only the prejudices of the natural attitude that have to be overcome, but those of the historical situation as well. But the implication is that this position can, at least in principle, be attained. Having overcome the prejudices of modern objectivism, including its hitherto unrecognized effect on transcendental philosophy, Husserl at last arrived at the life world and life world consciousness as the realm to be described, unquote. Since much of the book is an exposition of what Carr calls the historical reduction, I can't reproduce this exposition without going through the whole book. But Carr's work is much more comprehensive than the idea of the historical reduction alone. Both of Carr's books I mentioned are laser focused on formulating a phenomenological philosophy of history, even though the focus of the books is somewhat different in each case. Carr's Phenomenology and the Problem of History is a careful reading of history in the light of Husserl's philosophy and is technical in a phenomenological sense of employing many of Husserl's locutions that are not well known outside phenomenology. Carr's Historical Experience, Essays on the Phenomenology of History, is a much more widely ranging book, drawing on many sources beyond Husserl and engaging with non-phenomenological philosophies of history. This engagement sometimes presents problems. Carr says that a phenomenology of history does not address traditional problems in philosophy of history, and we can certainly see this in Husserl's later work concerned with history. Husserl doesn't attempt to engage with the tradition, whether the tradition of history, of historiography, or of philosophy of history, and he does not recur to familiar themes like historical objectivity or historical explanation, nor with contemporaries like Collingwood or Hempel and so on. This is a bit disorienting at first, as a philosopher of history may come away from phenomenology of history with a sense that none of his questions have been addressed. But it is also valuable to have a fresh perspective on history that cannot be had through coming at the questions with the same presuppositions with which one is familiar, or should be made familiar, we could say. In the following passage, Carr draws upon Dilthey in the exposition of his phenomenological philosophy of history. Quote, "We exist historically by virtue of our participation in communities that predate and outlive our individual lives. Through the we relation, historical reality enters directly into our lived experience and becomes part of our identity. Our membership gives us access to a past, a tradition, and a temporal span that is not so much something we know about as something that is part of us. This is the primary sense in which we are, in Dilthey's sense, historical beings before we are observers of history. This is the sense in which we are intertwined with history. This phenomenology of history does not dress itself directly to the traditional questions of the philosophy of history, questions of what history is in itself and of how we know it, though it can cast some indirect light on these questions, but it does address the question of why we should be interested in the past at all," unquote. In this case, the engagement with a non-phenomenological conception of history comes more naturally as Husserl and Dilthey knew of each other's works and commented on each other's works. In my episode on Husserl, I didn't discuss Husserl's very public criticism of Dilthey, decrying Dilthey's thought as a form of historicism in his essay, Philosophy as a Rigorous Science, also translated as Philosophy as Strict Science, which was published in 1911 in Logos, which was a decade after Husserl's Logical Investigations and a few years before his Ideas 1. Carr discusses phenomenology in relation to historicism in both his earlier and his later book. As I have said in many episodes, everyone has their own definition of historicism, so it shouldn't be surprising that the historicism of which Husserl accuses Dilthey is not the historicism of Popper in The Poverty of Historicism, or the historicism of Georg Iggers in The German Conception of History, or for that matter, the historicism defined by Hans Meyerhoff in his Philosophy of History in Our Time. Interestingly, after Husserl's Philosophy as Rigorous Science appeared, he had an exchange of letters with Dilthey in which they seemed to reach some kind of understanding that doesn't appear in the published works of either one. It would be a worthwhile project from the point of view of philosophy of history to do a close reading of Husserl's criticism of what he calls Dilthey's historicism, and then of their exchange of letters, and then Carr's discussion of Husserl on historicism. I'm not going to attempt that at the moment, as this would be a major project, and I'm only hitting a few highlights today. It would also be worthwhile to do a separate episode, or maybe a series of episodes, on phenomenological philosophies of history, which would not only feature Husserl, Ludwig Landgrebe, and David Carr, but also other figures like Fritz Kaufmann, Larry Scheiner, and Mark Blum, among others. Neither of the two go-to introductory guides for philosophy of history in the Anglosphere, which are W.H. Walsh's Philosophy of History and Introduction and William H. Drey's Philosophy of History, mention Husserl and phenomenology even once, so that someone coming to philosophy of history from this point of entry might be forgiven for not being even aware that there is such a thing as a phenomenological philosophy of history. But these books are still relevant to us in the present context. In several episodes, I have mentioned the distinction between critical and speculative philosophy of history, as a distinction was called by W.H. Walsh. Walsh traces this distinction between approaches to philosophy of history to the distinction between the senses given to history itself, which can mean the totality of past human actions or the narrative or account we construct of them now. And speculative philosophy of history corresponds to the philosophical analysis of the totality of past human actions, while critical philosophy of history corresponds to the philosophical analysis of the narrative or account we construct of them now. William Drey used the same distinction and the same terminology as Walsh. Maurice Mandelbaum used the distinction, but called it the distinction between material and formal philosophy of history. Arthur Danto called this the distinction between substantive and analytical philosophy of history. Danto further argues that substantive philosophy of history is not a legitimate form of philosophical inquiry, coming as it is considered, since it comes to be the associated with what he considers to be the discredited philosophy of nature that we find in 19th century philosophers like Schelling, a contemporary of Fichte and Hegel. By comparing history to nature, Danto manages to avoid what I consider to be the obvious comparison, which is comparing history to other special sciences like chemistry, geology, biology, and so on. When we do this, we find that in each type of specialist discipline of science, we can make the same or analogous distinction between the two sensories of history made by Walsh. There are, for example, two senses of chemistry. There are actual chemical processes and reactions, and there is our body of knowledge of chemical processes and reactions, the account or the discipline that concerns itself with the totality of chemical processes. The same can be said analogously of biology or geology. Partly this is a trick of the English language, and I'd be interested to know how well this distinction and its analogies hold up in other languages, because there are other instances in which the analogy doesn't seem to work very well. For example, it would be awkward, though not impossible, to make a distinction within anthropology between the totality of the history of human beings and the totality of the knowledge of this history. Carr formulates an account of this distinction, or an analogous distinction, that I think is rather helpful. Quote, according to the traditional classification, philosophy has approached history with metaphysical and epistemological questions. It has asked, what is history? How do we know history? Is it not as if these two approaches stood side by side, however, as separate but mutually respectful branches of the same discipline? Instead, they represent a historical sequence and a battleground of dispute. From its high point in the early 19th century, Hegel in parentheses, the metaphysics of history gradually fell into disrepute. By the mid-20th century, the criticism had grown intense, and it was not its results, but its very questions that were under attack. The philosophy of history was debunked from different points of view by such widely diverse thinkers as Karl Löwit, Karl Popper, Arthur Danto, and Jean-François Lyotard. We turn to these attacks in more detail in Chapter 4. The epistemology of history, by contrast, which had already begun in the late 19th century, grew in respectability in the middle years of the 20th, unquote. Carr makes of this distinction, like I said, that earlier that Walsh calls a distinction between critical and speculative philosophy. Carr makes it into a philosophical distinction between metaphysics and epistemology. Speculative philosophies of history engage with the metaphysics of history, asking what history is, while critical philosophers of history engage with the epistemology of history, asking how we know what we know about history. This framework allows us to further elaborate Carr's distinction, and we could, on this basis, posit other forms of philosophy of history based on other branches of philosophy. So, for example, there could be an axiological philosophy of history that engages with the ethics and the aesthetics of history, and a logical philosophy of history that engages with the logic of history. It is relevant in the present context that this well-known distinction widely employed in Anglo-American philosophy has no place for phenomenological philosophy of history. Carr implies this too. I earlier quoted Carr as saying that, quote, rather than asking what is history or how do we know history, a phenomenology of history inquires into history as a phenomenon, unquote. The two questions that Carr asks here are the metaphysical question, what is history, and the epistemological question, how do we know history? And he says that a phenomenology of history isn't trying to answer either of these questions. By placing a phenomenological philosophy of history in this larger context of traditional philosophical questions of metaphysics and epistemology, he's placing philosophy of history in a more comprehensive framework than the distinction between critical and speculative philosophy of history. So while on the one hand, we can think of Carr's work as narrowly phenomenological and therefore a specialized interest with limited appeal, on the other hand, we can see Carr's work as much more comprehensive than philosophy of history has been to date. And I think we need to supplement philosophy of history with the phenomenological perspective as it connects to other philosophies of history in ways that can be broken, in ways that can broaden our understanding of different approaches. For example, phenomenological philosophy of history is antithetical to the linguistic transcendentalism that I mentioned in relationship to Paul Venn and Frank Ankersmit, since linguistic transcendentalism in its strong form denies that there is any experience apart from language. In linguistic transcendentalism, language goes all the way up and all the way down. Phenomenology, on the other hand, is precisely the search for pre-linguistic, pre-predicative experience, which, according to linguistic transcendentalism, doesn't even exist. If you take issue with linguistic transcendentalism, phenomenology can be one source for conceptualizing an alternative. And the phenomenon of history that phenomenological philosophy of history seeks resembles what Frank Ankersmit calls sublime historical experience. So here we see a relationship between phenomenology and another alternative to linguistic transcendentalism. As I mentioned earlier, neither Walsh nor Dre even mentioned the possibility of phenomenological philosophy of history. In their defense, phenomenological philosophy of history is very recent. We could say that it is less than a century old if we trace its origins to Husserl's crisis, though of course there are historical antecedents to this tradition. Constructing a history for phenomenological philosophy of history ex post facto might draw on the ancient Pyrrhonists, already mentioned in relation to the Epoche, Descartes, Kant, Fichte, and of course, the German neo-Kantianism that was the context of Husserl's own philosophical development. With phenomenological philosophy of history being still so early in its development, there remains much to do in the tradition. So happy birthday, David Carr, and thanks for listening.